Hello, and welcome to another installment of the Ayer Oral History Project. I'm Dr. Christopher Padicky of the Ayer Historical Commission. Today is Monday, July 27th, 2026, and I'm joined today by Charlie Staples. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, Chris.
So, let's start off with early life. Can you tell us when you were born?
I was born in 1952 in Lowell, Massachusetts, and I pretty much grew up most of my childhood in Billerica, Mass. My connection to Ayer is that my great-grandmother and my great-aunt lived in Ayer, and we frequently visited throughout my childhood, from my infancy till my adult teen years.
So let's start with your family's connection to the town. When did your family, as far as you recall, first live in Ayer?
Well, my great-grandmother and her maiden daughter, Ruth Mellish, my great-grandmother being May Mellish, they moved to Pearl Street in Ayer right around 1931. It was number 2 Pearl Street because I have letters that are addressed to that location. And right at that same time, her father, my great-grandmother's father, Melzar, from Shirley, Mass., passed away, leaving her an inheritance of approximately $31,000.
This was about 1931. Okay.
The reason they came to Ayer was that May herself never worked, and her daughter Ruth worked at the bank in Ayer. They came from West Groton, where they had lived for 20 years plus, and Ruth would commute to the bank in Ayer for her job every day on the train from the West Groton station to the Ayer station, back and forth every day. They probably, my assumption is they moved to Ayer to be closer to Ruth's work, where she wouldn't have to commute every day. She could simply walk to the bank in Ayer.
There was some controversy, wasn't there, about the inheritance itself? Wasn't there rumors, not necessarily in the family, that she didn't receive the inheritance that she should have received, or that she was screwed out of everything because the family owned quite a few properties and businesses, correct?
No. Her grandfather actually was Samuel Farnsworth. Her maiden name was May Farnsworth. Her father was the son of Samuel Farnsworth. When Samuel Farnsworth passed away, his estate was divided up amongst his children. When Melzar passed away, he had 3 surviving children: May, her brother Frank, and her brother Edward Farnsworth. The estate was divided equally in 3 portions, Frank Farnsworth getting his father's farm on Great Road in Shirley, and Edward and May each getting equal amounts of $31,000 apiece, which was a fortune during the Depression at that time in the early 1930s. Apparently what I see is May took her portion and moved from number 2 Pearl Street, which was an apartment, and they purchased this house on 22 William Street. Upon purchasing the house, which was a one-family house with no plumbing, and it was just had no indoor plumbing. I don't know, it had electricity because I remember they had the old spool and wire type electrical wiring. But they proceeded to hire her brother Edward, who was a carpenter, and his helper, Joe Hart, as soon as they bought the house in 1935, they converted it into 3 apartments, an attic apartment, and they divided the first and second floor into apartments with various types of partitions, etc. Now they had bathrooms on all 3 floors at the same time when they put in the indoor plumbing. They put 2 bathtubs, one on the first floor, one on the second floor, and the third floor never got a bathtub. However, it did have the plumbing to install a bathtub in the future. She had tenants almost immediately when that was all renovated to help pay for their expenses.
So, it sounds like she didn't work. Her job was to be like the mistress of the house, kind of.
Well, May Mellish grew up. Well, she was born in Shirley, and they married Ed Mellish. She was born as May Farnsworth, married Ed Mellish, and he at the time was working for her grandfather, Samuel Farnsworth, and they moved to West Groton, where he took a job in the paper mill. He was a fireman, and also he belonged on the local baseball team. They lived there so he could walk to work, to the mill. It was much easier. And they lived there, and she was basically a housewife. She took care of the 2 children, which was her daughter Ruth, previously mentioned, plus my grandmother, Marion.
Okay. The Farnsworth family, I believe you said they owned a few businesses that we'd still recognize around town today, right?
Not really. There's the Farnsworth lumber mill in Shirley that was built by Samuel Farnsworth, which is still in operation today by a Farnsworth relative. The house next door was his homestead, which he was kind of a farmer because he raised hogs and various other, farm animals like everybody did in the 19th century. He was the richest man in Shirley at one point in time, and he was a selectman for several years on the Board of Selectmen in Shirley, and had a lot to do with the town happenings.
Did one of your descendants, if I remember correctly, own the Bull Run at some point?
He owned the Bull Run from approximately 1846 to about till he died in the early 1900s, and left that to his son Louis Farnsworth. The Bull Run was, at the time, was never really run as an inn. He basically rented it out to various concerns. It was a tea room and a restaurant and various other things during that period of time. And even his son Louis actually lived in the Bull Run, or a house, if you can imagine that.
Wow. Right. Bringing it back to 22 William Street, this property, when it was bought in 1935, it controlled more than it did now, right? Wasn't lot 20 Williams and what would be lot 24 also part of this property?
Well, number 20 was part of the original plot plan because the house lots were a lot bigger back then. On the other side, the adjacent house lot, she could have purchased that for $500, and it she wasn't interested in owning any land, but she did parcel out number 20 in 1955 and sold it to Bill Sambito, who became the local barber in downtown Ayer, and they built a nice house on it and raised their kids.
And that was to just get more income, have, you know.
Well, they had no use for it, and I don't understand exactly what brought about the purchase of it or how much it was sold for. I found no record of that.
Okay. All right. So, what are some of your earliest memories in Ayer about what time, and what would Ayer have looked like at that time?
Well, Ayer, since World War One, it was a military town, so Ayer was there was always a presence of Army uniforms everywhere in Ayer. My great-grandmother, May, always had military tenants in the downstairs apartment in the house at 22 William Street. My earliest memories are coming over at Christmas time, visiting my great-aunt Ruth and my great-grandmother May, and receiving Christmas gifts and having picnics with them outside. That was a big deal, sitting outside with a picnic on the picnic table. And that was a pretty much annual thing for us, and it was a big deal. And then finally in 1958, May passed away, and her daughter Ruth took over the house. And I remember the neighbor across the street was Ayer Oil and Ice Company, and it was owned by Chuck Horgan. He sold heating oil of various kinds, range oil, and number 2 heating fuel. Plus he sold block ice for the people who still had ice boxes instead of electrical refrigerators in their house. One of my vivid memories is of Chuck Horgan Jr., who was roughly my same age, standing in the back of his dad's ice truck with an ice pick in one hand and a block of ice in the other, artfully carving up a giant block of ice with an ice pick like an absolute pro. I was in awe of his skill with an ice pick.
That's pretty cool. So let's stick on the track of the house. Can you tell us, like, so now it's the late 1950s and Ruth owns the house. Let's go from there.
Well, Ruth continued to work at the bank, and she had various tenants, and she would often get personally involved with the tenants. They became friends of hers, And one of the memorable tenants was Herb and Ruthie Massengill, and they had a little baby named Donnie Massengill, and they lived in the apartment, and I always remember them, and basically we came over for holidays. They didn't drive. They never had an automobile. My great-grandmother and her daughter, they never drove. My great-grandfather, Ed Mellish, never drove. So these people were pretty much housebound, except for that they had a bus. They could go to Fitchburg shopping in downtown Fitchburg, which was a big deal at the day. But my memories from the 1958 on are basically just coming over for holidays until I became a high school graduate. I actually came to live here at 22 William Street with my grandmother, whose husband had recently passed, my grandfather, Joe Wiggins, and my great aunt. And I got room and board here while I took a job down at R. Murphy Company. I was 18 years old, and most people know R. Murphy as Murphy Knife, which had been operating since the 1800s, making all kinds of cutlery. And I was able to walk right down to Harvard Groton Road to work there every day from the house here on 22 William Street. And I paid room and board with Ruth and Marion. Marion lived on the first floor. Ruth lived on the second floor. And I paid rent on one of the bedrooms.
So that you can amaze all of our any millennial and Gen Z listeners, do you remember how much rent was?
I believe that I was paying Ruth $30 a week and she cleaned, made the bed, did the laundry, and fed me for $30 a week. For my part in turn was I had a vehicle and I could take them shopping. I could take them on Sunday drives to reminisce about their old neighborhoods in West Groton and in Shirley. And they loved to go for a drive.
So when you were 18, living at 22 Williams in Ayer, that would have been about 1967?
No, that would have been after I graduated high school in 1970.
Oh, 1970.
It was 1970. Okay. And I was probably here through 1971 when I finally decided to move out on my own and get my own apartment. And I felt kind of cramped here as a young man with the two old ladies, so I felt it was time to move in with a couple of my buddies. And we moved down to Columbia Street, myself and Bobby Marr and Bud Godso. Took an apartment that was owned by Francis Gardner.
So what was the early 1970s? That was pretty much the height of the Vietnam War. Do you remember was there a lot of action here, a lot of people moving in and out, military base being so close?
Fort Devens was just buzzing at that time. It was as busy as ever. We had all the C-130s were landing at Moore Airfield all the time. We had A-10 Warthogs that would do maneuvers around the range area. There were always uniforms everywhere. Every apartment building in town was full with military people who didn't want to live in the barracks, or the barracks were overcrowded, actually. They didn't have enough barracks to house everyone. So they actually got a stipend from the Army to rent an apartment in town. And the atmosphere, like I say, it was all Army all the way. Military vehicles, planes overhead, helicopters, Hueys was a constant sound. One of my memories is is walking across the Main Street Bridge, hearing a C-130 banking in for a landing at Moore Airfield, and actually looking up and seeing the pilot sitting in the cockpit.
Never that close.
It was that low over town. And it was so common. Nobody said boo about it. If somebody did that in a plane today, they'd be up in arms. It was our fighting men going to war, and I met many, many veterans that had come back from Vietnam at the time. And I had guys that had just gotten out. They were working with me down at our Murphy Knife Company, and one guy in particular, he was a Puerto Rican guy from Brooklyn, New York, and he was living here with his wife, and he just got back from Vietnam, and he got out of the army, and he took a job down at Murphy Knife, and I got the lowdown. He was in a infantry platoon over there in the thick of it, and I really learned a great deal of what it was like to be an infantry soldier and what our country was fighting for over there.
So it doesn't sound like Ayer, unlike a lot of other places in the late 60s and early 70s, had a large anti-Vietnam counterculture.
Well, let's put it this way. I think, in my personal opinion, I think half of the veterans that returned from the war were against the war. And that's only my personal opinion from knowing these people and hearing what they told me about it. It was not a positive experience for them, and they had no idea the purpose of fighting the Vietnam War. And they felt like their duty over there was just to stay alive and come home and help their buddies stay alive and also return home.
It seems like, when the way you're describing Ayer, it kind of reminds me of that film Born on the 4th of July, where the older folks are like, very patriotic and gung-ho, but then the ones who come back are like quietly, yeah, this wasn't like I was just staying alive. I was just keeping my friends alive. We were in that together.
Well, basically that's what I learned from the guys I personally knew, my workmates, and I also had apartment people that lived in the apartment house were mostly military, and a lot of them were returned from Vietnam, and many of them were not just privates, but they were sergeants and upper, even an officer I knew, and we would party together, and we would try not listen to the rock and roll of the times, and they wouldn't say too much about the war, but when they did talk about it, I never got the opinion that they were approving of it. And that, war is hell, whatever war it is. But this particular war divided our country. We had basically at the time, we had a generation division between the older people from World War II and the younger folks who were the children of people from World War II. And they had two opinions about the situation at the time, both opposite one another. And the older generation probably were fed by the news media, and the younger ones were fed by their actual experiences being in Vietnam or hearing the reality from people that came back from Vietnam.
It sounds like, and you may have a lot of knowledge on this or not, but it also sounds like indirectly the town would have benefited a great deal economically from the military base being there and all this action, um, all the soldiers coming through. Did it seem like Ayer at that time as a town was doing well?
Ayer was a boom town. There was so many people. Like I said, they didn't have enough barracks to house all the soldiers. In reality, every apartment building was full, and it was full with Army soldiers and their families, and the businesses were just straight out. Everybody was really had a big advantage here, all the businesses, because of the military, the population, and the money they brought to all the businesses, the restaurants, the auto repair businesses, the tire. We had a tire store, everything. We had Chinese restaurants, and it goes on and on. And they loved, I think the Army guys, they just loved getting off base and dressing in civilian clothes, and not appearing to be a soldier, just being an ordinary person.
So, so that's you and your connection to the town, early 1970s. What happens in your life next?
Well, I was, like I said, my job was working for R. Murphy Company, and what happened in my life was I eventually left Ayer and moved over to Bolton, Mass, with my buddy Mike Tully, who I graduated high school with, and we worked on our cars and our hot rods for fun, and I still worked at R. Murphy. I commuted back and forth from Bolton, Mass, until one day I had a bad accident on my motorcycle where I hit another car broadside, and I was badly injured. So my work ended at that point. I could no longer work. I had broken my leg badly and my arm, and I had broken my back. So I was out of commission, and I left my job. I wasn't working, and I didn't really have any connection to Ayer from that point on. My grandmother and my great aunt were still living at 22 William Street at that point in time. That was 1974.
This house never left the family, so can you tell us a little bit about who was living here, its ownership going from the 70s, 80s, 90s?
Well, there was a period of time in the 70s when I was out of state, so I can't really recollect what happened at the house at the time, but when the two old ladies, my grandmother Marion Wiggins and her sister Ruth Mellish, lived here together, they got to the point where they couldn't, they were getting very elderly, and it turned out that they weren't getting along well, so my mom's sister, my aunt Dorothy, decided that she would take them both up to her house in New Hampshire, and take care of them, and she would sell the house for them. And so she took the two of them up to Enfield, New Hampshire, and put the house on the market to sell. The house, apparently, real estate wasn't going very good at the time, and then for whatever reason, it wasn't selling. And it ended up that my Aunt Dorothy's two daughters ended up in one of the apartments in the house just to be as such as house sitters. And that the old ladies, my grandmother and Ruth Mellish, moved into their own apartment in New Hampshire. So as the house wouldn't sell, my mom, Louisa Staples, made a deal with my Aunt Dorothy to take the two old ladies, Marion and Ruth, both sisters, and she'd also take the house off her hands in Ayer, 22 William Street, and bring the old ladies back, and she would, being a nurse in senior care herself, working at nursing homes, she would, see to it that the two old ladies would be well taken care of at the house. In exchange for their care, she took the house off of Dorothy's hands, and she became an owner of the house at that point in time. The year, I can't exactly say what year that took place. As I say, I was out of state for several years, so I only had pretty much secondhand information, not being present at the time on that. So gradually, by about 1982, Louisa was still living here with the two old ladies. My grandmother Marion passed away right here in the sun porch as we're sitting here talking about her in 1982, and we buried her. And the following year, her sister Ruth Mellish, 1983, she passed away. And we buried her over in Shirley Center Cemetery next to Ed Mellish and May Mellish in the family plot over there. In the meantime, I was living in Harvard, actually the village of Still River in Harvard at the time, in 1983, and that's the year my daughter was born.
Cool. So it's now the 1980s at 22 William Street, and the ownership of the house, who's living here, because this is still in the family, right?
Yes. So after the old ladies died, and right around 83 to 84, my sister Elizabeth Hamilton was selling real estate. She was selling real estate in Groton, and the house needed lots of repairs. She made a deal with my mom if she put the house in her name and my name, that we would take out a mortgage to take care of the repairs. The front porch was collapsing and it needed a paint job. Being an old Victorian house, they're painting constantly. So what we did was my sister and I took possession of the house from my mom, Louisa. I took out a mortgage for $10,000, and we proceeded on repairing Liz hired a guy that actually appeared on This Old House, the TV show, and he rebuilt the porch. And in the meantime, using my skills, I did a quick rehab of the bathrooms and various other areas that needed attention. And my good friend Dwight French, with his painting company, completely pressure washed the house and repainted it in classic Victorian colors.
Nice.
I did the roof over the sun porch, and I did the roof on the newly rebuilt porch.
And there was even, at that point, because you said the house was in disrepair by the 80s, there was even a tree growing into the back of the house, wasn't there?
Well, there was a tree on the back corner of the house, but that was later. That was taken care of. One of the big issues we required the mortgage for is we had to put a new sewer line in. There was a maple tree in the front yard, and the roots had grown in to the pipe and blocked the pipe, causing a lot of damage. And we hired a guy with a backhoe, put in a new line, and while he was doing it, I asked him to scoop out a parking spot on the front lawn, taking away the front lawn and making a one-car parking spot, and which was a great idea. He had all the dirt dug out, putting in the new sewer line, so we went for that at the time.
Is that where the parking is now?
That was expanded to 2 cars later on.
Okay.
Yes. And the tree, there was a tree growing in the corner of the yard. It was a planted tree. It was one of those trees that has beans hanging off of it. I can't remember what the species of tree is, but they had planted it way back, and the thing got giant. So after Liz and I had possession of the house, and we did a lot of repairing on it, we decided to give my sister Dottie possession of the house, because my mom was here and she was becoming elderly and was a stroke victim and needed attention and care. So my sister Dottie said, well, we'll take the house and we'll take care of Mom and take possession of the house. So Dottie and her husband Mark moved into the house, and they had their daughter Amelia Rousseau.
So this would have been in 1987, 1988, about?
Approximately that time, yes. Yeah. And they were here, and they were attempting to bring the house back up. You know, maintenance on a Victorian house is quite extensive and ongoing. So they got to a point of living here and paying the heat. They had to put in it. They decided to convert from oil to gas because oil was getting so expensive, and the house was basically not insulated, and oil prices were always climbing at the time. So eventually they got fed up and they bought their own house and decided to move out and leave my mom, whereas my other sister Linda stepped into her place with her husband Rich and their daughter Amelia, and they took possession of the house.
This was in the late 90s?
I would say the year, I can't remember the year when they moved into the house, because it was, let's see, it had to be in the 90s sometime.
I know that Maggie Durand was already born, and they had been living in Winchendon for a few years already. So
So I would say it was it had to be after 96. I know it was after 96. It could have been, I don't know exactly. It could have been right around, like you say, like around 98, 99.
so about so that Dottie was here and living here with her husband and her daughter, um, and they were stewards of the house
Yes, and my
from
mom.
the late '80s, and your mother from the late '80s to about the late '90s. And then your sister Linda took over the house with her family, her husband Richard Duran and her daughter Maggie Duran, who still maintains stewardship of the house today.
Yes.
But you didn't stop helping to maintain the house, correct?
Oh no, I was I did a lot of maintenance on the house from there on. Initially, when my sister Linda and Richard Duran took over the house, they took their equity from the house they sold in Winchendon, and um, they put new siding on the house because it was due for a paint job again. So they re-sided the house, and they did extensive repairs on plumbing and wiring to make the place livable.
Mm.
And I did my share here and there. So yeah, and I've always been, since the early 80s, I've been doing maintenance on the house right up until recent times here in the 2020s.
Yeah, I know I've had you over a few times to lend your expertise. So you were around the community. You said you lived away. That would have been the 70s.
Well, I left and set. I left. I was still living in over in Harvard in the 1970s. After my motorcycle accident, I moved out of Bolton. I couldn't afford the rent because I was unable to work. I moved in with my girlfriend's parents, Rob and Fuller, and lived on Prospect Hill Road in Harvard. And I proceeded to go to school after my injuries, and I went to 23 months of intensive training at East Coast Aerotech and became a aircraft mechanic. And in 1977, I graduated from East Coast Aerotech with high honors, and I took a job at Cessna in Wichita, Kansas. And I was building the prototype Citation 3 business jet. And I was away that time. I was away for the next 5 years, living in Kansas, and then I moved to Florida, eventually ending back in Harvard in 5 years' time.
And then you've been around this community since, if not directly in the community, right?
Um, yeah, being from Harvard, living in Harvard, this is where you did your banking.
Mm.
This is where you went out to dinner. This is pretty much where everything was commercially. The video stores were here, banks. The tire store was here. Pizza shops were here. There was nothing in Harvard.
Were you around, could make observations of the town when Fort Devens closed, in the immediate aftermath of that?
Yeah, when Fort Devens closed, there was a big panic because they were subsidized heavily by the federal government having a military installation here. It wasn't just the out-of-pocket money they gained from all the soldiers, but it was actually federal subsidies for everything from taxes and infrastructure, the whole huge amounts, and getting shutting down the military base meant it was a double whammy thing where, they're not only going to lose all the money from the soldiers, they're going to lose all the federal subsidies, and they are going to be hurting in this town. They are going to have to really do something just to keep the tax base high enough to take care of the town. And it was a big controversy that went on for years. What are they going to do? Because they are going to lose big time on that situation. But it all seemed to have worked out, and actually it worked out for the best.
Yeah, when I first moved to this part of Massachusetts, it was the end of 2015, and I was living in Shirley, and people were talking about that event, the closure of Fort Devens, I believe in 1996, as almost like the apocalypse.
Oh, yeah.
It killed the community. That's how people phrased it.
Well, there was a lot of, this was a busy little town. I mean, this town had nightclubs. It had lots of, popular nightclubs. People came. They had the Wagon Wheel. They had the Rotor Club. Right down the street in Shirley, they had the Mohawk Club. They had the Shell Club. People from surrounding towns as far away as New Hampshire, Lowell, they all came to this area. And if they didn't come to Ayer, right down the street was Shirley. And they had clubs. They had, big name bands were coming to these clubs to play.
Really?
Popular bands would be down here. And they brought in all kinds of revenue, especially with the soldiers. These places would be full every night. And this stuff was going to dry up, and the bars ended up closing down. The nightclubs closed down, and but that wasn't necessarily due to the closing of Fort Devens. That was kind of prior to that, due to the liability insurance went up on these places to the point where they couldn't afford the liability insurance.
Interesting.
And it was due to the alcohol consumption and the accident rate from that. So that was the situation at the time. But in retrospect, you can look at Ayer today, and Ayer has come a long way from what it was, from the military town, the military buzz. The uniforms are not as prevalent as they once were. At the time, 2 out of 3 people you met on the sidewalk were from Devens. And there were the locals were few and far between, But I did meet a lot of good friends, local people here and there. One of the apartments I lived in over on Grove Street, on the other side of the tracks from the center, I lived in the Steve Carton's house, and he grew up. He was a Ayer townie, and I don't know where Steve Carton is today, but he was a real nice, friendly, good friend. And we'd go out and we'd do a lot of stuff together. And he ended up buying a motorhome that I had when I lived in Harvard. He ended up over there. I don't know whatever became of that motorhome, but I talked to him a couple times since then. But there was him, and there were a few other people in there that were friends. There was a guy named Mike Zeke, and then there was a heavy equipment operator, and his name actually escapes my memory at this point in time. I could picture him, but there were the Horgans, and there was let's see, who else was in here? Yeah, quite a few people I worked with at at the Murphy Knife Company had old Ayer townies. People, I actually worked with people that knew my great aunt Ruth Mellish. She was a fixture at the bank for 50 years. And so they all knew her. You know, when I started back in the 90s, when I was doing the family, actually back in the 2000s, back in like 2009, I was at the Shirley Center Cemetery with the cemetery commissioner looking at graves because I bought a stone for my great aunt Ruth Mellish's grave. And I met with the cemetery commissioners at the cemetery, and one of the girls says, "I remember your Aunt Ruth from the bank." If you can imagine that. And here it is, 2009.
That was like 20 years after she
Well, she died in 83.
Yeah.
She died in 83, and we buried her there, and nobody had put a stone or a grave marker for her, so we literally had to go out, and I had to point where the place was. Two of the cemetery workers, the cemetery commissioner, and her assistant came out. So it was 5 of us there, and they put a long metal pole down and hit the concrete vault.
X marks the spot.
And they said, "Here it is." So it was right where I remembered it, next to Ed Mellish and May Mellish, and the girl, her name was Frost, I remember, and she says, "Yeah, I knew Ruth." So at the time I had my laptop computer and I had everybody's picture, and I showed everybody there, and they thought it was the coolest thing to be standing, seeing the photographs of these people, and they're standing on their graves. You know, being cemetery workers and all, you know, and it was a nice picture. It was Ed and May Mellish's wedding photo, and then I had a nice picture of Ruth Mellish, you know, and they were like amazed, you know, and it just gives you a lesson on life and how short it is.
Live every day like it's your last.
That's right. It's later than you think.
And Uncle Charlie, is there anything else that you would like to share with us about your life, Ayer?
Well, Ayer will always be a part of my life. Some of my fondest memories are in Ayer. And it's not a bad little town. And I always said, Ayer's a nice little town. You know, it's not a bad place to live at all.
100% agree. So there you go. There's the Ayer Historical Commission take. Charlie Staples, thank you so much for talking to us today and giving us this recording.
You're welcome, nephew.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this recording, and have a wonderful rest of your day, no matter when you're listening to this.